Have you ever wondered how you go from a digital art file to a finished product? Well, you're in the right place. Working with CMYK versus RGB versus Pantone Colors is such an important topic for surface designers, but it's one that's often overlooked, and I've never found a place where it's comprehensively covered. Hi, I'm Kris Ruff, and I've been a surface designer for more than a decade. And before that, I was a graphic designer, so I've had all kinds of print production experiences. I'm going to walk you through CMYK, Pantone, RGB, and Hex Colors. So we'll start with CMYK Colors, and we've already kind of touched on those in the offset lesson, but CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. These are ink colors, so mixing them together, just like paints, you get a rainbow of colors. Sometimes they're also referred to as process colors, and they're primarily used for offset printing and digital printing. Next, there's Pantone Colors. Pantone is a brand name for a set of colors that are used for printing on paper and all kinds of other surfaces. And they're used almost universally throughout the world. That means if you use a Pantone color to spec a red ink in your art file, you can feel confident that the factory on the other side of the world in China will print the red that you're expecting, because they'll have the Pantone formulas to make that particular red ink. Before I became a surface designer, I was a graphic designer. So to me, Pantone meant these guides right here, because they're the ones that you use when printing on paper. So the numbers are either a 3-digit or a 4-digit numbered, followed by a C, which stands for coated or shiny paper, or a U for uncoated paper. In other words, a dull paper. Little did I know that there's a whole other Pantone world, and that's Pantone Fashion, Home, and Interiors, also known as FHI. If you're printing on any other surface besides paper, these are the colors you should use. So the numbers look a little different. They start with 2 digits that indicate the lightness or the darkness of the color, and then 4 digits after the hyphen that indicates the hue or what the color is. And then it's followed by TPX or TPG. Supposedly, TPG is newer and the TPX suffix is no longer used, but I've had many clients who still use it, so don't worry too much about that. They're really basically the same. So next up is RGB Colors, which stands for red, green, and blue. So it's the color system for light, like the light coming through your computer screen. Since I've always worked with pigment colors, where the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue, and mixing them all together creates black, I always have a hard time wrapping my brain around RGB because the primary colors are red, green, and blue. And it especially boggles my mind when I think that combining them all, instead of getting black, you get white. I mean, it does make total sense because with light, black is the absence of any light. And adding more light makes more colors visible until you have pure white light that includes all the colors in the spectrum. Another place you can find RGB colors is your TV screen. And if you zoom way in, you'll see red, green, and blue pixels, which are the building blocks for every color on the screen, much like the halftone dots in offset printing that we looked at earlier. So the question comes up, should you work in RGB or CMYK? I personally always work in CMYK for 2 reasons. One, I'm just more comfortable mixing those kinds of colors, which is probably the case for a lot of artists who have ever used paint. The other reason that I work in CMYK colors instead of RGB is because of gamut. Gamut is the range of colors that a particular color system can display. So here's the whole spectrum of visible light. And here are the colors in the RGB gamut. So it's a subset of visible light. Here's the gamut for Pantone colors, and finally the gamut for CMYK colors. So you can see that there are more RGB colors than there are CMYK. So it might sound like a good idea to use the broadest gamut of colors that you can. But the problem is, if you design something with all kinds of like neon bright lime greens and magentas, there's a good chance that you won't be able to reproduce it like that on anything in the real world. And sometimes that conversion from RGB to CMYK can really be pretty disappointing. You just kind of lose the brilliance of the colors. So that's why I choose to use CMYK inks, because I know if I create something in CMYK, when it comes time for production, I'll be able to reproduce what's on my screen. Now I can hear what you're saying. You're saying, hey, but what about Spoonflower? They request that you send RGB files. That's true, but their inkjet printers do use CMYK Colors, and they just ask for RGB colors so that they can convert them once they get them using their own conversion formula. That helps them with color consistency. Okay, so let's move on to the last color system, Hex Codes. It's probably the least familiar to a lot of you. But if you look at the color picker in Photoshop, this number here, made up of letters and numbers, is a hex code. You'll also find it in Illustrator's color palette right here. So hex codes are directly related to RGB colors. In fact, this 6-digit number is really 3 pairs of numbers. The first pair is the red value, the second pair indicates the green value, and the third is the blue value. So why the letters and numbers? Well, I can only guess there was a total math geek involved. Let me take a minute to explain. So obviously you know how to count, and if you start at 0 and get up to 9, the next number would be 10, except here. Instead, the next number is 0A, then 0B, 0C, and then when you get to 0F, the next number is 10. Weird, huh? So that pattern continues, and when we get to 9F, it switches to A0, then B0, until the very last number on this whole sequence is FF. Now don't worry, I just thought it might be helpful for you to know that there's some kind of sense of order to hex codes. Now since RGB is based on light, 0 is the darkest value, like no light, and F is the lightest. So if you had a value that's all zeros, that would be black, all Fs, that would be white. I don't think hex codes are used all that commonly in surface design, but if you need them, for instance, if a client asks you to use a particular hex color, then you can just type the code into the color picker in either Photoshop or Illustrator, and then add it to your swatches panel.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe to stay up to date on all of our latest videos.